When I haven't quite managed to scare people away. So we'll see what we can do this time. Let's begin with the prayer, shall we? In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this opportunity to dwell again in the wisdom that you offer us through your sacred scriptures. We give you thanks for this opportunity to allow your word to resound in us and allow ourselves to study your word, be enlightened and be enthused by your word. We ask that you enlighten our hearts and enliven our hearts so that we can become even more the kinds of disciples involved in the mission of the church that you wish. We ask this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So just to give me a sense of who's in the room, who is here who was not here last week? Okay, so you're excused from the homework that was asked of the others. I'll review very briefly just the main concept of our sessions as we go along. But I did want to begin by bringing people together around the Word. And last week, as we said goodbye, I asked if you would find something fascinating, if you had the time to do so. And this is not a test, and you will not be scolded if you didn't get time to do it. But I asked if you had the opportunity to find the fascinating in Acts of the Apostles. If you found a particular text that was there that was fascinating to you, that you thought, wow, this intrigues me or delights me, and in some way has my name on it. You'll recall that we said that it's a good thing to find the fascinating, see if it has your name on it, apprentice yourself to that particular narrative or that particular aspect of the sacred texts that are appealing to you, and then pretty soon you want inside of yourself the same power that is the power that enlightened the biblical figures. So for a moment, let's just do that. At your tables, if you had a chance, just share with one another at your table, just if there was a particular passage that in Acts of the Apostles that appealed to you and what it was. And for a few moments afterwards, we might ask for some large group examples. We won't spend long on it, but we want to make sure that we give you that opportunity to delve into the text itself. So take a few moments, turn to your neighbors, and introduce yourself to your neighbors if you don't know them, and then very quickly get to the point on what passage do you enjoy from Acts of the Apostles.
There's the baptism of the Gentiles explained, and Peter's talking, explaining to them that because circumcised believers is how they call them, confronting him saying, "You entered the house of uncircumcised people and ate them." And Peter explains this. I was deep in prayer, I was deep in prayers, and I said, that all sheep and all the and Peter says, "Oh no, because he's a good Jew, because he believes in the law." Certainly not, because nothing profane or unclean has ever entered my mouth. And the voice answered.
Take one more minute, please. About one more minute.
So God creates all of us, circumcised and uncircumcised. And so
And let's come back to the large group. So just a few examples. Coming back to the large group, brave people, just call out. What was your favorite, your passage that caught your eye and had your name on it? There was, especially the tables where there was laughter. What do we have? The hope that she found in the story of Cornelius, especially in light of the fact that she was a convert, and so she felt very much that she was included in God's larger, if you like, saving presence. One of the keen realizations around that text occurred at the Second Vatican Council under the influence really of Karl Rahner. Just a heads up that Karl Rahner introduced the concept that was adopted subsequently then in some of the documents of the Second Vatican Council that said, you know, although Catholics profess the Church of Christ as the Catholic Church as subsisting in the Church of Christ, God's saving presence is open to all of our brothers and sisters of other Christian communions. So God's salvation, whatever we think we mean by the word salvation, God's salvation is open. This is in the document Lumen Gentium, is open and available to all of our brothers and sisters in faith who are also Christian with us. And then it widens the lens in a beautiful way and says, and God's saving presence is also available to those with whom the covenant was first established, which we understand to mean the Jewish people. So God's saving presence is also available to those who do not profess Christianity, such as the Jewish people. And then they widen the lens again. It's a stunning document. Stunning. Okay, I'm a top-class nerd, and I actually read these things, but you should really read some of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. The wider lens is to those of what they call shadowy religions, by which they mean Buddhist and Islamic and various other different. I know they make a special mention of Islam, and then they also mention Buddhism and Hinduism, although in veiled terms. And then they go on to say that God's saving presence is available to even those who do not know Christ and who do not know God, if and when they follow the dictates of their own consciences. This is what Karl Rahner called the anonymous Christian. Now, I do not go to my Jewish friends and say, you know, you're an anonymous Christian, because that's not exactly pastoral. But in those documents, I want to say they're paragraphs 11, 12, 13, 14 in Lumen Gentium. They're absolutely stunning stunning paragraphs about the breadth of God's inclusivity. And oftentimes as Catholics, we forget that. Now, Catholics are bound by our Catholic tradition, and so we hold ourselves accountable to the one church of Christ as we understand it in the Catholic Church. But we do not deny God's salvific, God's saving work in those who do not declare Christ as their Savior. I don't know how it is in your world, but in my world, I run into people all the time who are not aware of that statement in the Second Vatican Council document. Again, the document is Lumen Gentium. I didn't make it up. Lumen Gentium, just so you know, all Vatican documents have a Latin name made up of the first couple of words in Latin, and then they have a really long English name that has nothing to do with the Latin name. So in English, the name of the document is the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church, in case you want to check me out. And that's why I say to people over and over again, you really must learn about what Vatican II did to breathe fresh air and renewal into our church. It's just huge. You know, today I was listening to a live stream from Santa Clara University that was taking on the issue of discussing a panel discussion on the crisis in the Catholic Church caused by the abuse scandal. And it was this most enlightening discussion, very measured, very wise. If you can go to Santa Clara University and see if you can catch the copy of the live stream that they did of it, it was absolutely marvelous. But in there, one of the gentlemen made the point, you absolutely must, we as a people must make sure that we understand the biblical underpinnings of that which is our great spirituality, which is why I was thrilled to be asked to be here, because that's kind of my thing. You know, I find oftentimes that we're a little bit nervous about the extent to which we can manage to make the connections between the biblical text and our Catholic spirituality. We'll keep coming back to that, so see if we deal with that in the next few weeks as we go forward too. Another favorite text that somebody had, and Susie helpfully has the mic there too, so we can hear you. Yes. Yeah, I like to say that one can imagine and this is very much in harmony with how people like to interpret the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles, which is his second volume. They like to say, well, the early Christian community very clearly, and you can see it in Paul's letters, especially to the Thessalonians and even some of the other early letters of Paul, very clearly expected a return of Jesus Christ almost immediately. Because if you think about it, it makes sense. God has operated in an extraordinary way and brought through Jesus Christ the fulfillment of God's plan in the world. So what else could we need? Must be almost time to be done. Next Sunday is probably it. And then next Sunday isn't. And then the Sunday after isn't. And the Sunday after isn't. And you can feel that kind of frenetic kind of anticipation. We call it an imminent eschatology, if you really want to do that boring thing with the people who come to your parties. And an imminent eschatology, a sense that the end time is coming any second now, any day now. We've got to get ready. And you feel that in Paul's letters. And then Mark's gospel, which was the earliest of the gospels, around 69-ish, 69, 70, definitely around the time that was witnessing the fall of Jerusalem, you still get some of that sense in Mark's gospel. I always like to say that Mark's gospel is written like my former grandmother-in-law, okay? She used to write 6, 7, 8-page letters, and I used to say to my husband, oh my gosh, Jim, I'm just exhausted from reading your grandmother's letters. And he said, why? And I said, she never puts a comma and she never puts a period. And I read like a fundamentalist. And so I'm waiting for the comma so I can count to 2, and the period so I can count to 4, just like they taught me in Ireland, you know. And so I'm racing through this text. And Mark's gospel, and she always writes in the present tense. Mark's gospel, although we read it in English in the past tense, is written in the present tense. And every start of every second sentence is, and immediately he goes here, and then he goes off over there, and then he heals these people, and then he goes into this house, and it's very much a storyteller, breathtaking pace, a gospel, which Matthew totally disapproves of and rearranges, as one should, if one wants to provide for the disciples of the newly emerging community a beautiful manual that has echoes of the Ten Commandments, that has echoes of the Torah, the instructional Torah. Matthew's gospel is really just has echoes all over it and we'll look at some of that tonight. It has echoes all over it of Moses and Jesus like Moses, and Jesus being the one who brings a new covenant. All of those Torah echoes are all over it. So Matthew massages Mark's gospel to fix what seems in his mind to be a few errors. He airbrushes in a couple of places those texts that we hear about Mary and Jesus' family in Mark, thinking that he's gone nuts. And that's airbrushed out a little bit in Matthew. And then in Luke's gospel, you see this less urgency and a much more kind of let's plan for the long haul because we think he's not coming back next Sunday. And then John's gospel, which is not one of the three synoptic gospels, a synoptic as in seen, as in kind of one eye. John's gospel comes with a different lens and invites us to contemplate with a much longer vision again. So it's just absolutely fascinating how all of these pieces come together. And I was so delighted today listening to the live stream to hear people say, we have to make sure that all of the people of God in our churches, all of the people who lead the people of God in seminaries, that they get a deeper grounding in our biblical tradition. It was really good to hear that. So one last one before we move on. It also reminds me that some of us were brought up when we did not really hold aloft this idea that nothing that God has made is profane. We used to consider most of the world, all sorts of things profane. I remember as a child that blessings were understood to be sanctifications of something that otherwise would be profane. Some of us are old enough to remember that we had holy water in every room in our house so that we could bless ourselves coming into the house, so we could swish a bit of holy water on things to turn them from being ordinary, which in those days meant profane, to being holy. And again at the Second Vatican Council, beautiful declarations of where holiness lies among the faithful, but also the sacredness of all of creation. And actually that's one of our themes tonight. So he's not a plant, but that idea that all of creation is truly, truly holy and our role in that. It's just marvelous stuff. I have to tell you, my particular favorites don't sound anything like as holy as yours all do. I have a great fondness for chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira. I just love how they get just kind of zapped dead in a second. Do you remember them? They pretended to have given all of the profits from the sale of their house to the Christian community, but they lied and they hadn't done so. And so, Peter cross-examines Ananias and immediately knows he's lying. God comes down and zaps Ananias dead. A handy-dandy version of a little cohort of 2 or 3 guys happen to be standing there who instantly stand up, rush over, get his body, bring him out, and has him buried before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I made up the time, but you get the idea. And then along comes his poor wife, who is subject to the same examination, also makes the same deathly mistake, and equally get zapped and down jump the same little cohort of guys and run off and bury her away too, all in inordinate speed. So that to say that, and also there's a healing at the gate. I didn't quite check out which chapter it is, but it's a fascinating text that has a comedic quality to it. Some aspects in Acts of the Apostles. If we were here, if we were here for weeks and weeks and weeks, I'd just do a whole session just on Acts of the Apostles and on two elements. One is how funny it is, literally funny it is, if you try to visualize what's actually happened, and you understand that it is an idealization of the community, not to be taken literally, but to be regarded as an idealization, a beautiful idealization, an important one, but also with a few kicks of humor. I mean, I kind of love how Peter says, of course we're not drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. It's like, well, maybe if it were 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, we might be drunk. But his reason for not being drunk is the time of day it is. It's not the virtue, it's the time of day. There are all sorts of marvelous elements like that. There's a second element in Acts of the Apostles that's really, I find, very, very wise, and it's this. If you follow the trajectory of Paul and Barnabas, or Paul and whoever he happens to be traveling with at the moment, you'll find that something strange happens. They will arrive in a town, and they will be hailed as superheroes, in some cases almost akin to gods, the people think. And they're placed at the center. And they're at the center, that is of everybody's attention. They're held up as paragons of virtue. And then something happens and they're not as popular anymore. And they have to, if you like, go to the margins. And then they move on, that is to say, they're excluded. They belong with the marginalized. And then they go on to the next town. They're hailed as superheroes or gods or wonderful, wonderful prophets. And then something happens, and again they move to the margins. And I find it telling. I did a whole paper on this once, a whole research paper on it, on this trajectory from to the center to the margins, to the center to the margins, to the center to the margins. And I heard a wonderful scholar one time say, those who are at the center are the sustainers of the institution. Their leadership belongs at the center. However, they would always do well to make sure that they or others are going to the margins from time to time so that they can be yelling to the center. Oftentimes, religious institutions will take somebody with a great prophetic voice and they'll place him or her at the center of the religious community, which means they're now sustaining the community, and that's all of their efforts are to sustain the community. And what they lose sometimes are their prophetic edge. And so this Dr. Lynn Osick, a beautiful, wonderful scholar and RSCGA sister, she said, she did this presentation one time on how all leaders within a church setting should always remember to either make sure they have somebody at the margins whose voice is yelling to the center, to them, or that they themselves regularly make sure that they know who's out at the margins so that they become a marginal voice and then a sustaining voice and then a marginal voice and a sustaining voice. And the whole trajectory of Acts of the Apostles actually echoes that. It's fascinating. Thanks for doing your homework. That was fun for me to hear. Let's move to continuing our theme from last week. And as we go through the weeks, we'll take these little homeworks and these little meditations that we do at home and during the week, and we'll pull them all together towards the end of our time together. Let's see if I can manage not to black out there we go, particular, let's see if I got it right. Yep. Okay. So this is our work for today. We ended up last week with the point that Christ is the sacrament of God, and the church is the sacrament of Christ. That's where we ended up last week. And we said that those sentences together can help us to understand what we mean when we say that, that we want to live sacramentally. It's not so much that we want to memorize the contents of each of the sacraments and their biblical foundations. It's that we want to get an overview of what do we mean if we say that Christ both embodies the fullness of God, both points to God and embodies the fullness of God, as we did last week. Then we say the church is the sacrament of Christ. The church embodies the fullness of Christ and points to Christ. And so our work during these times together is to try to understand, well, what does that mean? And again, as the gentleman said today on the live stream, he said, well, in order to do that, we need to really understand what it is that we are desiring to live out of when we say we want to live sacramentally, forming ourselves in Christ. So, what we want to do is, let's see if I got it right. There we go. We got that one. So we want to make sure that we spend some time knowing Jesus. That's, I think, why Susie, at least I hope it's why Susie hoped that I would come and do this series with you. If we're to think about living sacramentally, we have to understand what it is that we believe that Jesus cared deeply about so that we can model ourselves on him. In order to understand and get to know Jesus through our biblical text, I'm not presuming to say that we are only getting to know Jesus here these weeks through study of our biblical text. Of course, we know Jesus in so many different ways. But in order to know Jesus, we do have to have an understanding of what it is that Jesus knew from his scriptures, from the texts that he drew on. So today, what I want us to do, assuming it's okay with you, is I'd like us to spend some time really just delving into what Jesus inherited as his tradition. Does that sound like an okay plan to you? Okay? Because we really have to get a sense of that. And remembering that we're not doing this so that we can study how to become obedient. We're doing this so that we can figure out how to delight in the imagery of the Old Testament that sustained Jesus. I often think of my mom, who was a great storyteller. She used to make up stories all the time about peg, peg leg, and peg leg leg. Not very creative, but I believe one had 4 legs, one had only 3, and I'm not quite sure what peg leg leg had. I realize now she made up the stories as she went along to conform with whatever crisis at the time the child she was telling the story to was having. So she created a story of they were rabbits, very cute, and they were always dealing with whatever kinds of things one or other of us were dealing with as well. And I learned a lot about life from delighting in and allowing my imagination to be formed from those stories. And I believe it's crucial that when we engage with biblical texts, that we don't do so out of this sense of study and what does God mandate for me, but out of this sense of what stories is God telling me? What stories does God want to delight us with or allow us to hear and have our heart ache, or allow us to hear and engage our imaginations? What's the consistent set of visions that we can get from the storytelling? And remember last week when we began, I made the point that when we're looking at the biblical texts, especially, for example, now just when we're talking about the Old Testament text, the Hebrew Bible text, we are eavesdropping. We're not looking at history as it was written. We're eavesdropping on the reflections of the ancient Israelites about how God was actively engaged in the life of their community. And they reflect the very thinking and the times that wrote those. But it's important to read the text not to say, what is God telling us to do in the Old Testament? but rather to say, how did the ancient Israelites conceive of this marvelous engagement that God had with their community? Do you see the difference? It's about relationship. It's always about relationship. And that said, we want to look at the patterns that we can see in the Old Testament, and then we want to see how it is those patterns are echoed in much of the New Testament. And so, that said, I want to make one little note, which is one of the fine biblical scholars that I came across recently who made this comment. The Bible does not offer revealed morality, but revealed reality, and tells us the kinds of people we are to become if we are to hear its message faithfully. At your table, turn to your neighbor and just tell your neighbor how this sentence grabs you. How this sentence grabs you. The Bible does not offer revealed morality, but revealed reality, and tells us the kinds of people we are to become if we are to hear its message faithfully. The Jesuit John Donahue says exactly the same thing in an essay that he has also in an introduction to Catholic moral theology. So, just very briefly, this is not a big head trip, just an instant reaction. What's an instant reaction that you have to that sentence at your table? To move on. So hold your thoughts for now, and we'll move on. I think the emphasis here is appropriately from, if you like, the head judgment to the heart. You know, this is about with what kind of a heart do we live? And I meet people oftentimes. I know one woman, she's a good friend of mine. I've known her since she was, I think I've known her probably 30 years. And she's a beautifully devout Catholic, and she's terrified. She lives her life in terror. She breaks my heart. She is afraid of going to hell. And her entire life and her entire way of thinking her way through life and praying her way through life and praying her Catholic tradition is out of a fear that she might go to hell. And her daughter is my goddaughter. And her daughter is a young adult, about 23, 24 now. And we talk regularly. We meet for lunch. And I ask her all the time, how's your mom doing? She said, if I didn't talk with you, I wouldn't be able to embrace the Catholicism that my mom embraces. Because it's so scary, it's so punitive, it's so much about what's right and what's wrong in predetermined categories. And it lacks heart. This woman has a beautiful heart, but her faith has been colored by an overlay of morality that is affecting her spirituality. And so I think it's worth holding on to, that when we read the Old Testament and the New Testament text, that we ask ourselves, what does it appear that I should know about how to live my life in light of these texts? So let's acknowledge, first of all, something. There's a beautiful scholar. I just have loved her forever. She died, unfortunately, a few years ago of a brain tumor, very, very suddenly. Her name was Barbara Bow, and she has a beautiful book on the spiritualities of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament. And in her book, she points out, her whole book is a study of the biblical spirituality to enlighten us for today. And she makes the point that really there are only two major strands of spirituality in the Old Testament. Now, this is definitely oversimplifying, but let's face it, we're not doing the college course, so we're going with oversimplification. But she says there are two major strands of spirituality that we see in the Old Testament. One is the Creator God, the God of all creation. and all of the spirituality that goes along with that, the God of the mystery, the God of all the God beyond all names. And we'll come back to that and explore that just a little bit towards the end of our session today. But that's not actually the first spirituality that appeared among the ancient Israelites. The first spirituality that appeared was the spirituality of God our Savior. Our God is the God who reaches out, hearing those who cry out. How do I know that? Because of the Exodus. I'd like, if you would, to go to Deuteronomy chapter 26 in your Bibles. Verses, it says 5 to 9 on the slide, but I'd like you to start with verse 1 and read through verse 9.
Which chapter?
Sorry, Deuteronomy chapter 26. Chapter 26. Whenever we put up little biblical citations, the first number you get is always the chapter, and then there's always a colon, and then the second numbers are the verse numbers. So Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 5 to 9, but begin at verse 1 and go from 1 to 9 because it gives you a better context. You know, this is actually one of the oldest texts. Most Old Testament scholars will tell you that this is probably one of the oldest texts that was recited by the ancient Israelites. I love it. I love when I find that something is among the oldest. I find I kind of want to put my hand on it and touch it, and I feel like I'm again in touch with those who were the earliest manifestation of our faith, you know. There's something right about it. This was what you're looking at here are ostensibly the words of Moses, spelling out all of the stipulations of the covenant with God. You're in the midst of that. Most people think of the covenant, the covenant of God as the 10 Commandments. That's the kiddie version. That's the mnemonic. Okay? The covenant actually stretches from, I haven't looked at it for a while, Exodus 19 through the end of Deuteronomy, I want to say. Exodus chapter 19 through the end of Deuteronomy. So it's about over 600 various different stipulations and conditions and ways that the community should live and form itself as a people of God. And you're in the midst of this. And most scholars think this particular passage here from verse 5, then you shall declare before the Lord your God. My father was a wandering Armenian. From there on through verse 9, it appears that they sang this at the festival gatherings, at the offering of the first fruits at every festival, at every harvest festival, that this was the song that they sang. And if you think about it, the song is a marker of their identity. We are a people whose God brought them out of Egypt and saved us from destruction, brought us out of Egypt, and brought us through from the scourge that was part of our lives. So the Exodus is a huge factor in the identity of the ancient Israelites. Oftentimes, people will say to me, oh, you know, the Old Testament is big on sin, you know, Adam and Eve. And I'll say, no. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is big on sin, all right. But the sin is always the violation of the covenant. Because we're a people of God and we're bound in a covenant with God to form ourselves into this people who will hear, like our God, who will hear the cries of the poor. You know that there's no mention of the sin a la Adam and Eve, not one throughout the entire Old Testament until you get to the book of Sirach. Everybody always thinks that the whole, all of the focus on sin comes from the Genesis text, not for the ancient Israelites. The text that they quoted each other all the time around sin was always the text about you're not taking care of, as we said last week, you're not taking care of the widow, the orphan, the alien. You're not meeting the obligations of the covenant. It's not until we get to the writer known as Sirach that we finally get some mention of sin in the context of Adam and Eve, which then St. Paul picked up on his writing, which then St. Augustine picked up on with his writing and formulated the doctrine of original sin. Okay, but most people so associate the Genesis text with original sin that they think the Genesis text meant to be about original sin in the Bible, in its original state. No, we can thank Augustine for that, St. Augustine for that. Nothing wrong with the theology, but he used the creation story with Adam and Eve as the example for sin. If you're an ancient Israelite, on the other hand, what you really care about is this major theme that is found all the way throughout the Old Testament. It is visited and revisited, visited and revisited, visited and revisited over and over and over again. Just to check things out, I did a search again today on an app, I was going to say, whatever an app is now that we call it on a computer, a program on the computer that does a double check on how many times certain expressions show up in the Bible. And 227 times the expression "out of Egypt" shows up in the Old Testament. That's, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the Lord. Remember, I brought you out of Egypt. Did you forget what you're doing? Because you know I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt. I am the one who hears the cries of those who are oppressed and takes care of them. And you, the people of my covenant, you are supposed to do the same thing. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, I'll invite you to take a look at some of these texts and some other texts that can help us understand the centrality of the spirituality of the ancient Israelites, which, if you think about it, Jesus inherited this spirituality that says, my God is the God who hears the cry of the poor and the oppressed and the outcast. Christ, sacrament of God, church, sacrament of Christ, sacramental living for us. Remember I said it was my mission to make you feel, oh darn, I think I got work to do? Just making sure that we're back on that track again. Let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come back. Is that okay? Because I'm late on my break, I think. All righty, we're back. Okay, here's the piece that's very important to understand. What we have in the texts from the Hebrew Bible, the texts develop their theology of God from the earliest texts to the latest texts throughout the entire Old Testament. I remember somebody saying to me, well, lucky for us, the entire Old Testament always, right from the get-go, proclaims that there's only one God. And I said, yeah-ish. Because there is evidence that some of the earliest theologies around God held by the ancient Israelites, the people of God, there is very clear evidence that they moved from an understanding that was common in Mesopotamia, that there are lots of gods. We just like ours. Ours is a bachelor God who walks through the desert with us. All of the rest of those other gods of other places in Mesopotamia, those are bound to the cities. It was very common for every city to have its own pantheon of gods, okay? And so our God is the God who walks with us in the desert when we don't even have a city. Our God is a God who doesn't have a consort, a bachelor God, as I like to say. But in the earliest traditions of the ancient Israelites, you can see traces of the fact that they acknowledged that other gods existed, it's just ours is better. And then they moved to, but there are many other traditions, but we have ours. Then there are many other traditions of gods, other gods, maybe, but ours is actually the only one that matters. And slowly you see an evolution to the point where they say, no, actually, all you who think that there's other gods, you're cute, but you're wrong. There's only the one. And you actually get all the way, if you think about it, to St. Paul talking to the Corinthians in his first, I think, letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians, where they're worrying about what should we do with the food that's being offered to idols, to false gods, to other gods, because many of the Christians were involved in taking food, think barbecue, sitting around with other folks, either in their carpentry guild or in various other. There were all sorts of different guilds in the first century. And what if I'm at a gathering and they're offering food that has been we begin with a prayer. There's a prayer to one of the Greek gods, and then they're passing the food around, and this food has been offered to the gods. And St. Paul says, well, sure, there's no such thing. Well, he didn't really sound as Irish as I do, but sure, there's no such thing as other gods anyway. So what do we care? Go ahead and eat it, unless you're going to cause scandal to somebody who have weak faith. But there's this acknowledgement that there's a story out there that there's lots of gods, but we understand there's only one. That if you doubt my word, take a look at the text where Sarah and Abraham are taken off, and Sarah has to run back and quickly gather up her household gods. Sarah goes back to gather up her household gods. And there are various other little texts that are like that. So what's really neat is that you see, unfortunately, they didn't put our Bible in a nice, handy-dandy chronological order that I would have liked, from earliest theologies to later theology. But that idea that you see a growth in understanding of God from the earliest texts to the later texts. The very first chapter of Genesis, chapter 1, that's not the earliest texts. The later text, the second creation story in Genesis, the one that is specific, not the 7 days one, but that is specific to Adam and Eve, that's a much earlier text than the chapter 1, verse 1, 7 days of creation story. So you cannot rely on the look of the text to be actually showing you which set of thoughts were earlier or which were later. But that's important because what we're viewing in those texts is a growth in understanding over the course of time as to what it is, who and what it is our God is and what he has to do with us. And I'm looking at the time and I'm going to double back on what I said, I'm afraid, and not going to give us time in small group to delve into these texts. But the reason I put a lot more in my PowerPoint this time, so that when you leave and they have put the PowerPoint up, you'll be able to go back and find all of these texts in here that I'm just referring to in passing. But what you see here in the Old Testament is the Exodus event interpreted and reinterpreted over and over and over again, according as the ancient Israelites go through different experiences. The earliest Israelites really had a spirituality that was centered around the temple in Jerusalem. Nothing wrong with that. They had this notion, actually, wonderful temple, Solomon temple, the presence of God kind of came in through the roof, so to speak, in a special way, and we're surrounded, and their whole identity as Israelites, as Jews, as we would now call them, is centered on this temple identity. Well, then what happens is the Assyrians take over the northern kingdom. There's lots of threats for their survival over the course of the next 150 years. And then, horror of horrors, there's the exile. They are taken over completely by Babylon. The temple is destroyed, and all of the leaders of the community are exiled to Babylon. Now, all of a sudden, they have an identity question. All of our texts were texts that had us as a people of the temple. Who are we if we don't have a temple? You know what texts suddenly resurged? All of the texts of them wandering in the desert. Who are we if we're a people who are not home? All of the texts that emerged during the course of the exile were the texts that had to do with a recovery of the memory of them as a people, of their time in the desert, the time of the Exodus. They reclaimed the stories of how they had to go through the desert and they had to suffer the hunger and the worry about Moses. They revisited texts about Moses and they retold them, only now in a different way. It's the same way that you would tell one story about your boyfriend until he's not your boyfriend anymore, and then you tell a different story, right? They're not untrue. It's just in light of what my life produced here, I changed the narrative a little bit. Both are true, but the second one is kind of in light of a new awareness. Does that make sense? And that's what we are witnessing, eavesdropping on over and over and over throughout the Old Testament. So they reclaim the Exodus over and over again, each time in celebrating it in new ways as they form a more mature concept of God. And that's the key. We're witnessing a slow maturing of their understanding of God over the course of the ages. And so we get we get to this place where we understand the covenant. The later texts have what we call today the priestly focus. It's a bunch of editors who have a real emphasis on the priesthood and the liturgical rites, so to speak, of the ancient Israelites. And the texts, these later texts that are from what we call the priestly source, they actually are all of the texts that place the priesthood at the center of the identity of the ancient Israelites. By way of an aside, who am I if I'm an Israelite, but I can't be identified, an ancient Israelite, but I can't be identified with the temple? How do I identify myself? I identify myself as a person of, or as a people of the covenant. We identify ourselves as a people of the Exodus. We identify ourselves as a people set apart by the Sabbath. When did the Sabbath theology emerge for the ancient Israelites? During the exile. Because, again, we choose markers of identity for ourselves. What other customs might we suggest emerged from the exile? Anyone have an idea? Yeah. Passover, absolutely, the celebration of Passover, yeah. Dietary restrictions, and circumcision. All of those are later developments in the Israelite community. They didn't need to be part of the earlier Christian community when they were rooted in the temple, because the temple was enough, but now we're in exile. And then you get those blended in later to the practice of the ancient Israelites as the years go by. Very, very strong emphasis on covenant. And the texts that show up at this time are texts that actually retell the Adam story and the Noah story in light of the Moses covenant. Moses is the key. Because of Moses, they tell new stories about Adam and Abraham, the covenant God made with Adam, the covenant God made with Abraham. But Moses is absolutely the key. He is the prophetic paradigm, if you like, for the ancient Israelites. This is important because of what we know about the Gospels. So if Moses is the leader, Israel has a new reality. Pharaoh's religion of static triumphalism is overthrown, literally turned on its head. The oppression that is manifested by Pharaoh is overthrown. the politics of oppression and exploitation is replaced by a policy of justice and compassion. This is important because you will find exactly this approach echoed again in the New Testament texts in reference to Jesus. There's method to my madness in going back to the Old Testament. Okay? Well, we have it all there. Good. The new community that Moses forms intentionally creates laws, sets patterns of governance and order, and sets its own norms of right and wrong, and puts in place methods of accountability, and does all of this specifically so as to be in line with what we call the Mosaic covenant. That's not tiles, that's Moses, the Moses covenant. Very, very, very important. And so we see that the religion of God's freedom is equal to the politics of human justice. It's impossible, actually, for all the people always talk about, the God of violence of the Old Testament. I always find that such a misnomer, and most Hebrew Bible scholars will tell you, no, that's not really the focus of the Old Testament. It's not the violence. It's oftentimes God's righteous anger against injustice and God's absolute commitment to living justly. And then the prophets, when they come along, the prophets are almost always speaking to the leaders of the community, and they're pointing their fingers at the leaders of the community and saying, you're not doing it right, you're not doing it right. Now you have to understand something, we're talking about this at the break, you have to understand something about how the biblical texts write. It looks like causality, but it isn't. Okay, let me explain. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Does God really harden somebody's heart? No. If you're an ancient Israelite, your internal dialogue goes like this. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. All things are subject to God. Therefore, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's a kind of a reverse. It's not causality such as we have kind of learned of it in the Enlightenment period and beyond. It's a kind of a backwards trajectory. If such and such a thing happened, well, it must have been part and parcel of what God was about, because after all, God's about everything. That's not the same as a forward trajectory causality. Do you see the difference? So one of my professors used to say, this was his way of putting it, not my words, when Yahweh's in the house, we got land and we got children. In other words, when we talk of God as being, if you like, on our side, God has helped us to win the battles and gain the land, and God has given us children. Children are not a sentimental thing in the ancient world. Children mean survival. They're your army, they're your future. Remember, in the Old Testament, they have no concept of life after death. So what is life? Permanent life for the community? It's that the community always continue to survive. In a time where there is no afterlife beyond death, the life that matters is the life that sustains the community beyond the death of each generation. That's what's at the heart of it. So when Yahweh's in the house, we got land, we got children. When Yahweh's not in the house, in other words, we blew it. We offended Yahweh. This is their thinking. We lost the battle. God must have made us lose the battle. The women are barren. God must have been disapproving of us or the women or something. It's always that way. I'd invite you to read the entire Old Testament, just saying those little sentences to yourself. When Yahweh's in the house, we got land, we got children. When Yahweh's not in the house, we lost the land and we don't have children. Over and over and over again. Those are the criteria by which the ancient community judged its morality or its lack of morality, by whether or not God was ticked off with them or not. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And so you understand now that God is always ticked off in the Old Testament when it's evident, because we just lost the land. The prophets predicting the fall of the northern kingdom. After the kingdom of Israel is divided in northern and southern kingdom, they predict the fall of the kingdom. Why? Because you're not taking care of the widows, the orphans, and the aliens. You're messing it up. You're allowing yourselves to be haughty and to think that you're to be complacent and to think that God's on our side, and you're ignoring those whose voices are crying out to God. And by golly, along come the Assyrians. They lose the northern kingdom. They say, wow, oh, God's mad with us. We lost the land. See, we lost the land. It's always about land and children, because that in the ancient world is your survival. And so it is that we get to Moses. I'm going to go a little faster here. Our time is going to be short. Moses as the paradigm for the prophet. Moses is the supreme prophet of the Old Testament. Matthew's gospel is the gospel that reproduces images of Jesus as an absolute, I would say, embodiment of the perfection of Moses as prophet. Think about Matthew's gospel. Where does the sermon happen? On the mount. On the mount. Where does it happen in Luke's gospel? On the plain. Luke doesn't care about mountains. Matthew cares about mountains. Matthew always has Jesus going up mountains and coming down from mountains. Why? Because Moses went up mountains and came down mountains. Over and over and over again, there's this marvelous, beautiful Matthean, I want to say it's chapter.
It really was on the mountain, wasn't it?
Well, that's the great question. She says it really was on the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount. Well, according to Matthew, it was on the Mount. According to Luke, the exact same texts, minor changes, but the exact same address was given from on a plain. Last week, what did we say? All stories are? Some of them actually. It is never the right question to ask whether the story happened exactly that way. It is always the right question to ask, how is the story profoundly true?
However, if you go to Israel, won't they point out
And the lady is saying, if you go to Israel, won't they point out the perfect mount where Jesus stood? Yes, I have been and I have seen, and I went with a bunch of biblical scholars, and we all smiled politely and listened as the guide told us exactly where Jesus was at this moment and that moment and the other. And there are beautiful places of pilgrimage and of people's heritage, homage, I should say, of people to people's worship. But I would say that they miss the point. Okay, that would be the gentlest way that I could say that. Conscious of the fact that she's being videotaped, she says, gently. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, there's a marvelous text. I've told this one as a kind of a poetic reading for many years, so apologies for those of you who may have heard me do this poetic reading before. But I think it's a marvelous example of how Matthew's Gospel captures the Moses paradigm in chapter 8. So I'm going to tell it to you this way. After Jesus died, they were stunned. They were appalled. And then suddenly they heard that he had been raised from the dead. And they found themselves with new hope. And they found themselves enthused and excited. And they found themselves with words that poured out of them as if it was a running water. And they went banging on the doors of all of the early communities and said, "You'll never believe what we've heard. You'll never believe what we've heard. He's raised from the dead. He's alive. He's alive." And so it was that the early Christian community began to tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth, Son of God, who was raised from the dead. And the stories gathered from one place to the other. And editors gathered the stories and put them together and found wisdom in the way of the telling. And so Matthew tells it this way, this one story. He says, when Jesus came down from the mountain, and now you know about Jesus. Jesus will come down from the mountain. Jesus like Moses. Jesus and mountains, always the mountains. Great crowds followed him. Now you know something else about Jesus. Jesus and crowds, always the crowds. And then a leper approached Jesus and did him homage. And now you know yet something else about Jesus. When you approach Jesus, you do him homage. Jesus and mountains, Jesus and crowds, always the crowds. When you approach Jesus, you do him homage. The leper approached Jesus, did him homage, and said, "Lord, if you wish, you can make me clean." Now you know something else about Jesus. Jesus and mountains, Jesus like Moses, Jesus and crowds, always the crowds. When you approach Jesus, you do him homage. If you wish, you can. If you wish, you can. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, and there it is. He will touch you. Jesus and mountains, Jesus like Moses, Jesus and crowds, always the crowds. When you approach Jesus, you do him homage. If you wish, you can. If you wish, you can. He will touch you. Jesus said, "I will be made clean." Jesus and mountains, Jesus like Moses, Jesus and crowds, always the crowds. When you approach Jesus, you do him homage. If you wish, you can. If you wish, you can. He will touch you. I will be made clean. His leprosy was cleansed immediately. Zap! Jesus and mountains, Jesus like Moses, Jesus and crowds, always the crowds. When you approach Jesus, you do him homage. If you wish, you can. If you wish, you can. He will touch you. I will be made clean. Zap. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you tell no one, but show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses prescribed." See, I told you, Jesus like Moses, Jesus and mountains, Jesus like Moses, Jesus and crowds, always the crowds. When you approach Jesus, you do him homage. If you wish, you can. If you wish, you can. He will touch you. I will be made clean. Zap. Jesus like Moses. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, a poetic reading. Talk to your neighbor and just first reactions, just like that, about the particular text that you just heard. Going to bring us back. Remember, I did say that I hoped to engage the imagination along the way. Margie made may I quote you? She made a lovely observation. She said in the beginning it was, you were telling a lot of the story behind the story, and I was kind of tracking. I'm kind of paraphrasing you. But then bit by bit, as the story went along, I found it to be about me. And I think that's often what happens when we step into the scriptures and we find it fascinating and we find it to have our name on it and we spend some time within the story and it kind of holds us. We think we hold it. It really holds us. And this is one of my all-time favorites. It's a story I love to tell actually in 2 or 3 different ways because I sometimes like to show the leper as kind of falling at his feet, but rather reluctantly because he tripped, and just to see how that changes the story a little bit. But those are just interpretations. Very quickly, in the amount of time that we have, I want to cover some information that will be on these slides that in due course then you'll be able to go back to, because I'm not able to do an entire review of the entire Old Testament, but I want to make sure that we covered today this sense of the centrality of the Exodus, the God who is our saving God, the God who holds us to the covenant that we have made with Him. And one of the things that you'll find, and again, what's on here is a list of some of the problematic elements in society that the prophets were really railing against. And you can see them: well-being, affluence, oppressive social policy. Sometimes I look at this and I say, have we changed that much? When I look at this, I say, these prophets who are speaking in the Old Testament text, they are as relevant today as they were back then. And Jesus knew that they were as relevant in the first century as they were in his historical time frame. And that's what's so important for us when we think about what it means to be a people of sacramentality, embodying the best of Jesus and pointing to Jesus. So you'll see that. You'll see, I put on here, for those of you who aren't really familiar with the prophets, there are the prophets we call the early prophets, and there are the prophets that we call the later prophets. All of them. A prophet is not somebody who predicts the future. A prophet is one who speaks for the will of God, who speaks for God. Obliterate from your mind any connection that you have between prophets and some kind of foretelling of the future. It's not helpful. There are instances where the prophets foretell doom to the people and they turn out to be right. But that's not foretelling in this kind of magical sense. Their purpose is to be God's voice to the people. Next week, as we go along through, we'll ask ourselves, who are our prophets? Who's getting... Bishop Romero is becoming canonized, senior moment, canonized this weekend, a prophet among us, So the early prophets, the former prophets, and then the later prophets, the latter prophets. You have Amos and Hosea before the exile, and then you see in the northern kingdom and then in the southern kingdom, you have all of these characters here. You have after the exile, you have all of these characters here, and just for good measure, Amos is one of my favorites. He's a cranky man, definitely cranky. And I've put up here for your enjoyment some of the major issues that he had with the leaders whom he addressed with his words. And so you see a little bit of information about him, and then you see some of the issues that he has in the right-hand column. Ditto for Hosea. Again, you'll be able to read of the relevance of Hosea in tackling the injustices of the time in which he lived. And then last week, I gave you a little reading from Isaiah. That was technically 3rd Isaiah. Isaiah, the text about the prophet himself, are the earlier chapters, but Isaiah was written by 2, if not 3 different hands over what might be even a course of about 300 to 500 years. So the book of Isaiah is not written by a guy called Isaiah. It's about a guy called Isaiah, and then subsequently edited, and circumstances changed according over the years. It'd be like saying writing about Francis, St. Francis of Assisi, and then people who wrote about him, and then people who wrote in homage to him, and then somebody compiled them all and called them the Francis writings. That kind of idea. And so there's stuff here for you to look at. And the call for us is to make sure that we understand that we're called to live prophetically in this day and age. That's probably the hardest thing for us to take on. I just loved how Pope Benedict actually described what we're called to do, though. This was in his Caritas in Veritate document. Again, I'm a nerd. I actually read these things. And he says, hearts of stone need to be transformed into hearts of flesh, exactly like the prophet Ezekiel said, rendering life on earth divine and thus more worthy of humanity. Isn't that beautiful? Rendering life on earth more divine and thus more worthy of humanity. When we talk about the kingdom of God next week and the week after, we're talking about this attempt to make the life on earth more divine. The theologian Teilhard de Chardin I'm a great fan of his, and he always talks about the presence of Christ needing to accumulate in the world. He said from generation to generation, the presence of Christ doesn't just dissipate as each person dies. According as each person lives into the fullness of the presence of Christ in their own personhood, that stays, that sustains and accumulates generation after generation after generation, until eventually he had this vision that the entire world is just completely chock-a-block filled with nothing but the presence of Christ. So much so that the thin membrane that separates heaven from earth is ruptured and heaven comes about on earth. Isn't that cool? I think it's awesome. I don't care if it happens like that. All stories are true and all that. I don't care if it happens exactly like that, but there's something fine about the imagination that says we are to clog the world, filled, full to overflowing with the presence of Christ. I have a friend who's a religious of the Sacred Heart, and we'll finish with this. As she was holding Barbara Bow in her arms, Barbara Bow, the theologian who speaks about these 2 different spiritualities, and we'll get to the other spirituality next week, by the way, of the Old Testament, the spirituality of creation. But my friend Lisa was in the same community as Sister Barbara Bow, the biblical scholar who was dying from the brain tumor, and they're religious of the Sacred Heart, and their spirituality is the Sacred Heart spirituality, which I confess when I was a child didn't do much for me. The statues, the heart, the blood, it just didn't feed me spiritually when I was a child. Lisa said, I held Barbara as she died. I was there to hold her. I took care of her the last weeks of her illness. And I heard her heart, and I was holding her to keep her comfortable. And I held her, and as I held her, I heard her heart beat. And then it got slower and slower and slower. And I realized it is not that I am hearing her heart stop. It is that I am hearing her heart return to the one heart that beats for all of creation. Isn't that beautiful? I like to think that when I die, my heart will return to be in tune with the one heartbeat of creation. Let's take that one home with us for this week. And if you could, find a text in Amos. We're just going to stick with the prophet Amos. Find a text in Amos that rings your chimes or makes you crazy. Sounds good? Thank you all so much for being here, and we'll see you next week. Oh, yes. What a prophet is? A prophet is one who speaks for God. Yeah. Thank you so much. See you next week. Thank you.